Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us for Nature Traditions Old and New on this February evening, and a warm welcome to everyone wherever you might be. I want to begin by acknowledging the people who have protected and cared for this land for thousands of years, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, emerging. I acknowledge the land was never ceded, and I welcome any Indigenous people who may be with us today. So, welcome to the Port Phillip Eco Centre's first online festival. What an achievement, and what an exciting time that we live in, that no matter where you live, so long as you have internet, you can access events like this. My name is Bhakthi Puvanenthira, and I'm the editor of ABC Everyday, which is a website about all the everyday problems that people face, from work and money to relationships, family, and in fact, gardening and outdoors as well. Our session today is titled Nature and Culture, and in it, panelists from multi-generations, talent, and multicultures will discuss the important old nature traditions and the new ones that we must cultivate to preserve our planet and cultures. So I thought I'd begin this session by reading a poem, because there's so much beautiful writing out there about nature. It's been, I guess, the foundation of so much great literature. And I wanted to start with this poem by Wendell Berry. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. So I hope that sets the reflective tone that we will get from our panel of passionate and multifaceted panel guests today. Let me introduce them to you. If we could just bring up everyone's videos now so you can see them, that would be fantastic. Welcome everyone. So I'll start with Dean Stewart. Dean is a proud and passionate Wemba Wemba-Wergaia Aboriginal man of Victoria with well over 20 years of experience developing, coordinating and conducting cultural tourism, education and environmental and interpretation programs. Dan is the creator and coordinator of the highly successful Aboriginal Heritage Walks and is employed as Aboriginal liaison for the Royal Botanic Gardens, Melbourne and Cranbourne. He also assisted in initiating a similar program for the Sydney Royal Botanic Gardens. It's an honour to have you. Thanks, Dean. We also have today Jonathan Law. Jonathan is a multi-talented biologist and dancer, currently working as Partnerships Manager and Knowledge Officer at the Yarra Keeper Association, and he sits on the Our Future Cities Committee. Jonathan has a diverse range of experience and education, including public health, climate change, social sustainability, agriculture, urban planning, ecology, animal behaviour, environmental policy, and we just found out before the panel, also bonsai plants. He really can do it all. He has worked on various projects in Australia, Singapore, Malaysia, South Korea, and China, and feels equally at home inside an office or trekking through the rainforest. Thanks for being here, Jonathan. Our third panelist is Neil Blake, OAM, who I'm sure needs no introduction to many of you, as he's the founding director of the Eco Centre, which has set up this fantastic panel, and a multi-award winner. He's been widely recognised and loved by the community for over 3 decades. Neil is the Port Phillip Baykeeper for the Global Waterkeeper Alliance and he provides an independent voice for our bay and its inhabitants large and small. Neil regularly participates in environmental panels, consults with groups including EPA Victoria, Melbourne Water, local and state government, and you can hear Neil on Radio Marinara 3RRR, which I've been a long time listener of, by the way, or in the award-winning doco Baykeepers. Neil inspires all ages to prevent plastic pollution, assisted by his alter ego, Captain Trash, the musical pirate who teaches the 5 R's: refuse, reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove. Thanks so much. And certainly not last but not least is Sharon Hunter. Sharon was born in India with Iraqi Jewish heritage. She's presently an educator at the Port Phillip Eco Centre. Following her studies in anthropology and Koori studies, Sharon has become a secondary school teacher. In this setting, she brought together her passion for cross-cultural initiatives and her commitment to social and environmental justice issues. Her teaching career began in the western suburbs of Melbourne, working in a school setting that was culturally diverse and students and their families across socioeconomic divides and from many different cultures. Place-based education for young people has been a focus for Sharon in her design and delivery of early learning schools and community education curriculums. So thank you all so much for being with us today. I'm sure you'll agree it's a cracking lineup. So I just want to flag one piece of housekeeping, which is if you want to ask a question, you can just type it in the Q&A icon there, and we'll address that after we've done a little bit of a discussion with the panel. We will then get to that, no doubt, exciting list of questions that you all have. So I wanted to start with something, go back to the beginning. So culture and nature, we know, are so intertwined. When you were growing up, and this is for the whole panel, how did you learn the value of nature? And who were the people that imparted that knowledge to you? Maybe I'll start with you, Neil.
I think I grew up in a relatively rural area, so there was lots of open paddocks and trees, but it had been also picked through as a mining site in the gold mining days. So this is in central Victoria, and I think one of the things that I really picked up in just growing up in that environment was the fact that we could go and pick mushrooms and take them home and cook them. And so nature was providing, and it was just that sense that this is something really, really worth looking after and valuing. So that's my early days. But then we moved up to the Murray River, and I really got to appreciate how the river actually brought so much life and to the area, and it was really the lifeblood of the country. So I just think spending time in nature when I was younger really was the key.
Dean, you're from a proud Indigenous heritage. Can you talk a little bit about how you learned that, as whether it was younger or later in life?
Oh, you never stop learning, do you, really? Well, I suppose a bit like Neil, I was born in country Victoria, and it was haystacks and biking, 5 kilometres to go and play football with a mate and all this type of stuff. Then when I hit teenagerhood, came to the big smoke, and it was really when I started to get into revegetation that it really changed for me. And I actually started in revegetation before I really got into the cultural aspects. And for me, I can still vividly remember it was a pivotal moment for me. I worked for the Shire of Eltham in the Environment Department. I set up all the friends groups and all that stuff. My office was a 300-year-old manor gums with rainbow lorikeets and all this type of stuff. That was my 9 to 5. But I used to run all the guys out of Pentridge and everything on parole and all the rest of it. And we'd finished off the day, and I was there by myself just weeding out all this terrible angled onion out of a re-veg area. And I'd put my weeding tool in the ground, probably only about half a foot in front of my face. And then I heard a flutter over the back of my head, and a yellow robin sat on top of the weeder and looked down at the ground where I'd been weeding, then looked back up at me, then looked back down at the ground, and I put a little worm there, and it jumped down in front of me, grabbed the worm, jumped up on top of the weeder and flew away. And it was just me. It was just this completely wild bird, and that was it. That was it for me.
And what do you think was happening in that moment?
I just, at that moment, for me, it wasn't black or white. It wasn't culture or ecology. It was all encompassed in that one moment of a small little bird and a small little me on my hands and knees in the dirt. It was.
You're in it together.
In it together. That's right. As we all are.
Yeah. Love that.
What about the worm, though, Dan?
Yes, we need to eat. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It sacrificed itself. Good.
Well, Sharon, why don't you go ahead next and tell us about, your early experiences?
Yeah, my early experience was my frangipani tree in the front garden of our little plot in Delhi. So I grew up in a very big metropolitan city, many millions of people. But there was this frangipani tree that I took to be sort of a second home, and was visited by lots of things in the garden. So this is age 6, and I would climb this tree because frangipani trees are very easy to climb because of the way they grow. And I could sometimes sort of hide myself up there, and a gecko or butterflies would sort of come and fly through the tree. So that was like the very first sort of visceral experience of nature. But I was also very lucky to have friends whose father, and this is going back to the 60s now, right? Whose father was a very avid bird watcher. So complete with pith helmet and safari khakis in an old Land Rover, he used to take us kids out to Bharatpur Bird Sanctuary just outside Delhi, and many hours of driving in this bumpy Land Rover, and that was the first time that I had this beautiful experience as a young child of watching nature very closely and listening to nature, intently. Because of the way he facilitated this outing, which was very serious for him, but somehow he made us little 7-year-olds and 8-year-olds also feel very serious about it as well. So it was that elder relationship, I think. And Dean, you would relate to that, with the First Nations peoples, this real just doing things side by side and having things demonstrated to you and quietly sort of learning. And then it just went from, I think I'm very lucky to have been brought up in India, because it went from Bharatpur Bird Sanctuary to Corbett National Park and tigers and, traveling on an elephant into the jungle. And so those were my very, prominent memories of just being in love with nature. And my mother always telling me, nature is my cathedral. So although we were a Jewish family, I was a very bad Jew. I didn't really go to synagogue very often or anything like that, because nature was our cathedral.
What a beautiful sentiment. Thanks, Sharon. And Jonathan, do you want to talk about where you learnt?
Yes. So I was lucky enough to be born in Melbourne, actually, but I did grow up partially in my younger childhood in Singapore and Malaysia. And although he passed away when I was probably in my early teenage years, someone who was very influential to me in teaching the value of nature was my maternal grandfather. And he grew lots of fruits and vegetables like rambutan and durian, and he imparted that connection of nature in that real sort of sense of, what crops are, what plants are compatible with each other and all that sort of stuff. And he really also fostered my love of, I guess, martial arts, and then which turned into dancing at a later stage. But he was kind of my first wushu teacher, and effectively had to swat mosquitoes as well at the same time. And he imparted that concept of chi and energy to me, how like we're fueled by the plants we eat, the water we drink, the sunshine we soak up. It's energy in, energy out. We're part of this sort of, as soppy as it kind of sounds, circle of life, as you might want to say.
Well, I mean, that's held up by science as well, isn't
it? Yes, exactly. And I think he growing up, he would be probably one of the more influential people in terms of trying to connect to nature. And I think another really significant part of my life as well, when I was 17, I went on this scout sort of camp to the Northern Territory. And I remember I passed out, I fainted from heat stroke, and I woke up by a camel licking me. A feral camel had kind of come up and just started licked my face, and it smelled absolutely terrible, but it's always really stuck with me, this connection to nature.
I think everyone has a school camp story that maybe didn't connect them to nature in the way that they'd hoped for. I love that. Love that. So actually, Sharon saying that nature is her cathedral, or that was the family motto in some way, brings me to my next question. And this is very open, and, you know, it's obviously a fluid thing in people's lives. But if anyone wants to jump in, are you religious? Are you spiritual? And if so, how does nature play into that? Or potentially the opposite, where it's the science of nature that speaks to you? Go ahead, Neil.
I'll just say that I have no religion whatsoever, and it was not something that my family sort of, although they had some vague connections to religion in their past, they weren't churchgoers. I went to Sunday school a couple of times, and when I said I couldn't be bothered doing it again, they didn't mind. And so I just spent time in nature and connecting and doing other things. So that was, I feel, a sense of freedom in that, and having the opportunity to make up my own mind about the universe and how it works, and just connecting with nature and looking after it, I suppose, has now become my religion.
And it is also just a sense of independence that you get from that. You know, it's your own connection, as opposed to being part of a community per se.
Yeah, and if I can just add too, that one of the memorable moments when I was a 5-year-old was seeing wedge-tailed eagles strung up on a sheep fence, and I'm looking at that and asking my father, why are the birds strung up to the fence? And he said, oh, the farmers don't like them. You know, and I'm thinking, if there's some kind of sense of creation, you know, then that didn't make sense to me.
That's really, that speaks to me really quite loudly, what you've just said. I found that in the Judaic sort of Christian sort of model, it never really grabbed me, because it was all about dominating nature and sort of taking control of it and trying to harness it in some way. And that just never gelled. Even when I was very little, I just couldn't get my head around that. I was quite young when I first was struck by the ridiculousness of that. And I think it was because in India, rivers are very important in sort of the spirituality and the ritual of Hinduism in particular. And I always saw these, you know, the river, the Ganges, for example, just as this powerful force. And so for me, it was always the humans sort of having to sort of watch out, you know, because nature was everything. We were part of nature, and it was all powerful. So I could never understand that sort of religious mantra. So I think over time.
And I would just add that, you know, because my family's Hindu, there's actually part of the harvest festival in Hinduism in Pongal, in South India, in Pongal. You actually, there's a day where you pray to the cows, and you put garlands around the cows, and you know, you thank them. So it's, you know, it's just part and parcel of.
Yes. so I think I'm more pagan in that regard, you know, so like, and sort of see myself on a level, if anything. And I think that just out of that grew this idea that it was more a spirituality of finding my place in nature, that journey of finding my place with the wild animals. And more recently, I've spent a lot of time in the wilds of the United States, where, you know, there are big things that can kill you, and it's very confronting, you know, to have that experience, and it's humbling, and I think that that's created my own relationship with spirituality that is sort of encompassed by my relationship with nature.
Dean, how about you? Are you religious or spiritual at all?
Very much not religious, but but very much spiritual. And just echoing the excellent sentiments already done there. It's the spirituality has come from the earth, from the land, the animals, the wind and things like that. And
the little bird telling you.
The little bird, that's right.
Yeah.
And as the old people say, it's always written twice, once on the land and mirrored in the cosmos and the stars. And I'm actually running my own Indigenous business these days, and I talk about how traditionally nothing was written down; it was an oral tradition, and you knew the creation stories of the rivers and the waterholes and the mountains, and you danced the moon and you sung the Milky Way, and the sense of music permeating in harmony with the seasons, with the animals and the plants and migrations and all those type of things, and you as a human being revolving within that is something very, very deep. And the more sort of stuff that I could bring back to that is really great in terms of singing that land. These days I call it educating year nines these days, but for me, I might be taking them on tours along the river and, you know, through St Kilda and things like that. But to me, as an Aboriginal man, I might be giving them information, but I'm still singing to them in a way and trying to provide some deep knowledge and make them think about the sound of wah, the black ravens that, you know, that still even today with the groups I had today is still in South Bank and cormorants and all those type of things, and make them key into those elements instead of walking through the city as we tend to do these days, and to take a step back and to listen to nature.
Yeah, and what else is spirituality but taking a step back and to connect yourself to something greater?
Absolutely.
And Jonathan, what about you?
I am, I guess, quite religious. I particularly influenced by my mum, and I don't think it's necessarily restricted to one particular religion, but a lot of religions around the world the deities are based on a nature entity, for example, god of the sea, god of fertility, god of harvest. And I guess a lot of places, especially temples, are holy, and perhaps they're not legislatively protected, but you'll find temples that are in the middle of the city, a haven for animals and wildlife. And so for myself, I think it was very influential, especially when I was young, having to actually trek so far or like to this random rural area with my uncle. I remember one time, I think I was only 6, and we climbed this mountain just to go to this beautiful temple, and you'd reach into this pool and you'd have to take out either a white or a black rock. So if it was black, you'd have to go down all the way and come back off and try again until you get a white rock for the blessing. So I feel from a personal perspective, it's very influential as well. I mean, my mom won't let us stay at particular places for too long if it doesn't have good feng shui, which translates to wind and water sort of aspects as well. So, and I guess that's also particularly helpful as well. We have practices when we connect, if we have a string of bad luck or tragedy happens or things aren't necessarily going well with life, we have sort of like a good luck replenishment rituals where we sort of, I guess, shower and bathe in burnt flowers. So it's been quite influential for myself personally.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And thank you for sharing that. I understand it's really personal, so I appreciate all of you being so forthcoming with those stories. I guess Neil kind of flagged that, you know, his work now, his mission is his religion, and we know that a lot of people feel a deep commitment to modern sustainability movements, environment movements, collectivism. But one of the things about the outward facing parts of these movements is that they tap into the way things have been done in the past. And so what do we think that, you know, we've lost perhaps that could help us in our efforts to be more sustainable? Jonathan, I might start with you again.
That is pretty good question. I think I really sort of brainstormed the concept of new and old traditions. So I actually had slides, if Reiko wants to put them up, to help some guidance of pictures.
Go for it. Just allow Reiko to get going there.
Yeah, so I guess there was sort of like three old nature traditions I sort of really identified with. If you wanted to go to the next slide, Reiko, is sort of like wanderlust, the old concept of just going out and exploring, you know, taking in the fresh air and all that sort of stuff. And then the next one,
gorgeous.
Yes, so beaches, pristine rainforest, that sort of stuff. Next slide, thank you. But then there's also the old, I guess it's contentious with some people is going to the zoo, actually seeing animals that you can't necessarily see, or maybe you shouldn't even see in real life because you shouldn't be where they live. But it's an old tradition, but it's still new that I feel a lot that supersedes time. Old generations love to see animals, I feel, and I feel the zoo is a great place that brings people together, and even sort of like a spiritual connection as well, like because some animals are holy as well. Next slide, sorry, Reiko. Yes, next, thank you. Yeah, and place of worship visits, which we just sort of covered before. This is in Yonggongsa in Busan, which is quite a trek to get to, but very much worth it. And I guess in terms of the modern sort of situation, it kind of flows into building on these new nature traditions. If you want to go next, sorry, Reiko. Next, yes. So these new sort of places, and especially because of COVID, this new world we sort of live in, is we have to sort of, I guess, value what we already have. And this is my favorite place in Melbourne to go at night. It's the end of Docklands pier, and you can like capture the sounds of Melbourne at the same time. It's so quiet, and it's this sort of nature connection in a way that you're so close to so many people but so far at the same time, and it's just this ultimate sort of like balance here. And yeah, then as we sort of move on as well, like I think Sharon also like mentioned the fact that it's, you know, webinars, people are vulnerable, people connect so easily now through online as we are now. And the last one I would say is, if you want to go next, is this new sort of rise of combining nature with pop culture, which is what I'm particularly sort of passionate about. And, you know, you turn this into something that's trendy and it's fun and it's something to be in, and I guess reposted in a way, and it gets people, especially the young people, more mobilized and more connected to nature that they otherwise might not have been, especially in these small green urban pockets in the city.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, I certainly didn't expect anyone to present anything that detailed, so I really appreciate the work that you put in there. Do you think in terms of that cultural you know, creating those cultural moments. Who do you think's doing that really well?
I would actually say it's actually quite. I would have to flag what Neil sort of said in one of his YouTube documentaries. I can't particularly know which one, but it was the fact that especially young people, I guess I'd like to think I'm still young to some degree, but especially the people in students in high school are much smarter than I am, and are just taking, I guess, action to determine the future they want to live in. And I think that's something that's really sort of inspiring to see. Like, I remember going and speaking at a school, and I was amazed at seeing how active these students are during their lunchtime about trying to actually like recycle and plant and go out there and actually serve the environment. And I think that's amazing.
Thank you.
Can I
Neil,
jump?
Go ahead, Sharon. Go ahead.
I just was inspired by what you just said, Jonathan, because, and just to back that up, that during COVID in particular, a new ritual started where people, out of sheer desperation to be connected in some way to others and to places outside of their walls at home, started to go into nature places. So golf courses became a ritual, and people discovered that, oh my God, there's urban biodiversity is extraordinary, you know. And then they would go into local parks, and Elstonwick Reserve, that is going to be an ephemeral wetland and an urban forest. The Bayside City Council is sort of redoing this old golf course and returning it to sort of nature, if you like. People just owned the place and were just celebrating the fact that they could be in this wonderful nature corridor in the middle of a big city, and it was ritualized during COVID because you only had that hour to sort of go out and make that contact. And so yeah, young people that I've worked with are very connected and very sure that they want to do what they can to steward nature, to preserve the planet. So they're doing a lot, you know, to be connected themselves. Yeah.
We actually recently published a video about how to spot a platypus in the Yarra, and you know, our videographer had to go out to Warrandyte 4 times, I think, because it was pretty tricky, but we got there in the end. And it's one of those super exciting things that I don't think people realized they had in their own backyard. You can absolutely see a platypus in Melbourne's our own waterways. You don't need to go anywhere else. So Neil, I wanted to come to you next. What are the you know, old ways that we can hold on to, and any new ways as well that we can embrace?
Well, things have changed a lot, but my sister reminded me that back in the 1960s, when we were living in a country town, we didn't have a bin. There was no garbage. Everything that we used, packaging was either cardboard or paper. Plastic didn't really sort of factor it much, apart from maybe a few new radios or things like that, a few consumer items, but generally packaging wasn't plastic. So anything that we had, we could put it into the garden, or, you know, it was the sort of circle that we want to, in that circular economy that we want to aspire to now, already existed back in those days. So, and recently, when I had to get up very early a week or so ago for a particular appointment, I thought, I better get an alarm clock. So I went down to the usual sort of emporiums to see if I could find an alarm clock that didn't require a battery or something that you had to plug into a wall, and they just simply don't exist anymore.
No, they don't. Like an old-fashioned enamel one, you mean? Yeah,
well, they were variously made of just metal or with a glass face on them, and they would have a metal spring in them that you would wind up, and the thing would tick-tock and it'd do its job, and it'd wake you up in the morning, and then you just wind it up again to keep it doing its thing. That simply doesn't exist anymore. I'm sure they've been removed from the marketplace because they're too reliable and you don't have to buy another one or some sort of other thing such as a battery regularly to keep it working, and that seems to me to be a definite structural thing we've got going in our economy that we need to try and get away from.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dean, what about you? What are the old ways that you think we could hold on to?
I think for me, in a nutshell, it's about deep and intimate observations. And through deep and intimate observations, we can make deep connections and intimate connections as individual human beings and as collective human beings, with our connection to place, with our connection to the world and ecology and everything like that. And it's certainly what the old people did with deep observations and backed up with the songs and music and that I mentioned. But ultimately, really, what is a scientist today but a person that does deep and intimate observations of the particular focus that they're working for? They're elders in their own way within their own sphere of influence and focal point as well. They're the new old elders in a way, and of course they've got knowledge to be able to impart to that younger generation as well. And not only that in terms of observations, but as we all are very much aware now, the Earth's letting us all know anyway. I mean, even Joe Biden just the other day was mentioning the existential crisis of where the environment is at, and David Attenborough just yesterday as well, with the UN panel talking about we're on that edge, and the land is actually letting us know. And it's interesting. The point mentioned about how we all had to, with the lockdown, we spent that hour and were forced as individual human beings, particularly in the urban setting, to find the spaces in nature. I actually don't think that's a coincidence. I think there's a bit of synchronicity there for us as a world. The global global emissions have gone down because we're not traveling in the aeroplanes or using the cars and all those things anymore. I think there's a synchronicity associated with that for us as a people which has forced us to take that step back and to really start to reconnect, particularly hard in the urban areas, to force us to be able to do that with that deep observation, all those elements as well, and the land's letting us know at the same time. And I mean, the other thing which I find really interesting is that all the politicians are just going on and on about we need to listen to the science about COVID. What about all the science with global warming and all the where did that go?
Yeah,
but that's observation as well,
Yes, and it seems to me you're a well-trained observer. I just want to throw to the audience and let you know that Q&A button is there if you have any questions for our highly passionate and multifaceted panel. Please put them in there. And it's great that you've brought up global warming. And I want to ask the panel, how do you think our nature traditions will change? It's so hard to know what's going to happen next, but maybe how do they need to change? How will they change? I'll leave that open to you. Sharon, what do you think?
Could I just go back a little bit and just pick up where Dean left off, and that is that not only do we look at the science for COVID and say, let's follow the science, but we also responded to COVID with an emergency straight away, but we can't seem to respond in the same way to climate change. It's taken us 35 years. It's, and it's killing us, but it's not killing us in the same way as the pandemic is, in this sort of very short, sharp sort of burst of deaths, if you like, other species are becoming extinct. So I think that's really interesting, and young people are onto it. I was doing a climate leadership course during COVID, had the most extraordinary discussions, and these young youth leaders were saying, why can't our leaders respond in the same way to climate change that they are, that they want us to respond in this emergency sort of mode to COVID? So that was just one thing I wanted to say, but new ways of being in nature in light of the reality of the climate challenge and the warming of the globe. I think that for a lot of people, there's a sense of grief. And I've been really involved in talking to people about grief associated with this, this challenge of climate change and what's happening to our planet. So I think that our nature experiences are going to be grief counseling experiences, in a sense, that will be processing loss at the same time as processing our success at perhaps preserving a little spot. And that's where urban ecologies and biodiversities within our cities become so important, because they give us that opportunity of success to actually protect and nurture in a very deep sense nature in our place. And I think there's so much to learn from restoring First Peoples knowledge and bring that attention to place. So Dean, for example, to walk with you, to walk country with you in an urban setting is a profound experience and can really change people's relationship to how they perceive their stewardship of that place in relation to this potential of loss, and they're sort of catapulting into grief and despair about the planet. So I think that restoring the knowledge of our elders and of our indigenous people, First Nations people all around the world is terribly important, I think, in how we experience nature in the future.
And I think that something that really stood out to me from that was you talking about respecting Indigenous knowledge systems as something new. Now, obviously, the knowledge systems themselves are very old, but in the history of this place, that's actually quite a new idea in some ways for a lot of people. So, which I'm sure,
ironic, like stupidly it is, but I mean, it shouldn't be, but it is.
Yeah, I'm sure. Did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, it's for me. I see us all as custodians, all as caretakers. The ancient First Nations narrative is one narrative of all of our need to look after the land and the earth and ecology, and ultimately it's the core, because without the earth you won't have any of that anyway. We all have a part to play. And I can't certainly talk about Northern Territory or Kakadu or anything like that. I'm Smith Street and Coburg, and things like that. But for me, in relation to the stuff that I've done over the decades, I use the word cultural tsunami with all the changes that have occurred in the 200 years of European occupation and the changes that have happened. And with that, we as Aboriginal people have lost much of our ceremony, our culture, our special places and all those things. And so as a 21st century Aboriginal community today, we are also relearning it as well. We talk about the fire stick farming. All the elders that knew that unfortunately passed with the arrival of the very first white people. So as Aboriginal people, we are relearning our connections to ecology and those things as well. I mean, and so we're at that same point on the same path, because we don't know a lot of that information because of the fragmentation from 200 years ago. So we're learning it. We're relearning it together as well. I can only talk about some elements of Victoria, obviously. You know, I can't fluently speak the language. I don't know anybody except for one Wurundjeri woman that can fluently speak language as well. I use the word the Aboriginal Renaissance as because we are relearning and redesigning and re-strengthening and rediscovering those connections. So for me, that it's just I will just learn from our traditional knowledge. Unfortunately, just like the flowering grasslands or the intact bits of Indigenous ecosystems left, it's just not there, and we need to relearn it again as well. Yeah. Anyway, that's my point.
No, that's pretty profound. So thank you, Neil. What do you think that we need to keep? What do we need to embrace with global warming?
Yeah, I think what Sharon was mentioning before about the grief that people are experiencing, and it's really the grief that the Indigenous community have experienced too. One of the best cures that I can find for grief is spending more time with people who love you, or with people that you love. And if you love nature, get involved with a local group that's putting back Indigenous plants into the environment, starting to understand, you know, how to recreate those habitats. So you're working with fellow travellers, and it just means you just feel much better at the end of the day when you've spent a day doing that, rather than sitting alone in your room sort of thinking, oh, things are so bad, what am I going to do? And you meet the traditional owners, you know, that's part of the journey. You want to find out more about the origins of the land and those cultural connections. I can remember we founded Earth Care in 1989, and at their 10-year birthday party, everyone was sitting around and having a fantastic time. And I was looking around the room, and all the people, there's about 25 people who met each other through Earth Care. And I'm thinking, these people are lifelong friends. You know, and they were feeding each other love. And that's really what, that's my solution to it all. We just got to get together and work to put it back the way it should be.
That's friendship and collegiality and, you know, collective care as part of the tradition, really. And I think, you know, I think that's such a great point. The cure for anxiety is action. And that's what I really heard from you then. That's great. Jonathan, did you have anything to add around the global warming aspect?
I think, unfortunately, it's a sad reality we're facing that the landscape and ecosystem is bound to, unfortunately, change in the face of climate. The climate crisis, we're seeing it. We keep seeing news articles about, you know, all these sort of things. And this means the landscape and our actual connections that we know can dramatically change very quickly. I know the Eco Centre loves scuba diving and all of the sort, but climate change, you know, might lead to more and more common and regular extreme bleaching events that could wipe out coral reefs that we can't connect to anymore that we used to. So I think there's the climate change will need to adapt, definitely, and innovation is also the key there as well, I guess, especially, well, there's the food basis and there's also the water basis, desalinated water, crops that are more, I guess, resilient to drought and all that sort of stuff. So I think in the face of climate change, we'd need to, unfortunately, take a step back. I really value the amount of connection that, you know, connect with nature, but there has to be a level of respect, because obviously overexposure we've seen it. Like the most popular, most beautiful natural places in the world have been terribly abused, like Halong Bay in Vietnam or James Bond Island in Thailand, that have been closed to tourists because it's simply been too abused, and the ecosystem needs to recover accordingly. So I definitely think that in the face of the climate change, we need to connect more, but respect more in the right way.
Yeah, that's really important, that idea of stay. We don't have to go everywhere. We don't have to see everything. You know, human species needs to just also live with a more of a sense of restraint. And that's why urban environments that are protected can become so much more important, because you can stay away from places that are vulnerable and sensitive. And so I agree with you, Jonathan. And young people are demanding that adults start to speak the truth about climate change and not sugarcoat things. They know that their future is going to be different. And they want adults to start talking with very real ideas for that world that is going to look very different. Yeah.
I wanted to wrap up with a question around multiculturalism. We've heard so much about today about the importance of the Indigenous knowledge systems being an Indigenous renaissance, as Dean put it. And that is such a huge, hopefully going to be a big part of how we move forward in the environmental space. But there's, we also heard from Jonathan around some of the, the cultural heritage that you bring to your understanding. I wanted to ask the question, can true multiculturalism help us protect the planet? And if so, how? Sharon.
Yes, I was on this one when I saw your email. I thought, wow, this is interesting, because first of all, what is true multiculturalism? So I've never quite, quite sort of got my head around that. I think we try desperately to sort of create that, and sometimes we succeed in many ways, and in other ways we don't. But for me, I suppose, on a very personal level, is to acknowledge that other cultures view the world through frameworks that might be different to our own experience, and to really have a curiosity about that, and try and see, what their view of the world is, and then, see where those similarities are as well, but to embrace those differences of how you view the world. I think there's different cultures relate to nature so differently. There could be, from my experience growing up in India, you would go to the Ganges and you would be horrified at the state of the river, right? It's one of the most polluted rivers in the world, and yet it is this sacred river that is worshipped, and it anoints people, it immerses them in spiritual bliss, it gives them hope, etc., and yet it's polluted. So it's a very complex world that we live in, and not everything is obvious at first sight. When I was up in Arnhem Land at Yirkala and went to Homeland for ceremony, beautiful river, but there were nappies, disposable nappies that were being used, and they were being thrown into the river, and so here you had this sort of moment where you're in this beautiful place and here's this plastic sort of floating around, because what do? You have children and you have to use these things because there aren't sort of laundry services, etc. But I think that cultures also have these very rich understandings that we can listen for and engage with, even if it's growing food together. There's some wonderful projects where migrants are coming together to share what they've grown back home in the Sudan or in Ethiopia or in Afghanistan, and then they cook for each other and share stories of their connection to food and nature, of course, because that
Yeah,
comes from
I might just, only got a few minutes, so I do want to go to everyone else. Thank you so much. I actually, one of the things that came to mind when I asked this question was actually seeing how many kids there were from diverse backgrounds involved in the climate strikes last year, and the role that they're taking in leading that conversation is just, it's really inspiring for me personally. Neil, what about you? How do you see multiculturalism playing into the future of this?
Well, yeah, I think touching on the various people, the young people in the climate strikes, I really think that we need a new culture. And it's like Dean was saying, it's a renaissance, but we need to give up some of the old ways, because too many, like my family background was in mining and forestry. So we're just extracting resources. It's an important thing, needs to happen, but it also needs to be managed. And I think the major problem that we have is many cultures just see nature as a commodity. They might have some sort of connections to a river or something like that, but it's still a commodification of nature without actually giving back and nurturing it is not really culture. And so that's where I think we need to just take a fresh look at what the future, how we need to be in the future.
And along those lines, we do have one question that I'd like to throw to Jonathan and Dean on before we wrap up. And the question is from Pascal. Thank you. Do you think our global world with a rising middle class and yearn to travel would ever return to a more sedentary, connected, local, and truly connect to their local environment? COVID-19 is making us stop travel, which Dean mentioned. Perhaps it's time that we take a deep understanding of how to live in harmony and share this knowledge in our neighbourhood. So, Dean, do you see a world where people kind of pull back?
We're sort of, as we mentioned, we're sort of doing it already as well, 100%. And I think it's an absolute synchronicity that this COVID, which is a natural element, has actually come along to make the entire world take a step back and to make us rethink some of those elements again and to reconnect about. I don't think that's a coincidence at all as to where we are. Whether we act on it is something else again, or whether we try to just get out there and do all those things. Hopefully it is that element of reflection as well. And I mean, in regards to multiculturalism as well, I need to say that traditionally, we were one of the most, we created multiculturalism. We had about 40 different languages just in Victoria, different gods, different customs, different laws, different beliefs. We were absolutely multicultural, nothing homogeneous at all. And in fact, in the 21st century, every single Aboriginal person is a mix of European and Aboriginal and all those type of things. My name's Dean Stewart from a Scottish Highlander, and we've got all those reconnections as well. But there is, for me, there is a base, and alluded by Neil as well, is that overriding need to reconnect and that honouring back of the earth and of the land as a global culture that we need to reassert again.
Thank you so much. I love that we invented multiculturalism. Jonathan, did you have anything to add on that question before we, of pulling back and the travel and living simpler lives?
I think it's quite interesting. I think there is that, at the one hand, how the travel and sort of the abuse in the environment is very sort of pressing. But I think multiculturalism it won't just help, but I think it's absolutely necessary. Like what we do in one country can affect another that have nothing to, for example, rising sea levels from due to the climate crisis is inundating islands that have nothing to do with sort of, I guess, the carbon sort of driven industries that are causing it in themselves. And I think the concept of multiculturalism and taking up practices and the best of every other country's sort of innovations is going to be necessary. Like if one country innovates waste recycling or repurposement technology, it can be, well, rather should be shared with the rest of the world. Likewise, an innovation of how I think it was Kuwait who maybe made desalination first. And, you know, much like how COVID vaccines are being shared around the world, I think, you know, these innovations to try and, you know, help protect the environment, whether it's recycling or, you know, repurposing, you know, carbon dioxide into something that's a bit more, I guess, useful in a way, is something that needs to be shared. So I think multiculturalism is a double-edged sword in a way. Like, people love to travel, people love to get immersed in things, but I think it's that connection of multiculturalism that's going to help us do better for each other.
And as we become better at events like this, you don't necessarily need to leave your house to have experiences that can share that knowledge. So that's fantastic too. We might have to leave it there. I just really want to thank our panel, Sharon Hunter, Jonathan Law, Dean Stewart, Neil Blake. I want to thank Rico and April from the Eco Centre, who worked really hard on this event and on the entire festival, which will continue for the next 2 days. So please go and check out all the other events. I will be at the, you know, I'll be checking out the Zero Waste on Saturday. There's so much other cool stuff on. So make sure you look at that website, and I hope that you've taken something away from this. I certainly have. Have a great night, and we'll see you later. Thanks.